posting and live streaming. Okay.
Are you waiting on me? Sorry.
Yes, we are here. We're ready. So when you're ready, let's go.
Okay, yeah, sorry. You said 5 to 10 minute break, so I averaged and assumed it would be like, 8 or something.
Okay.
All right, let me turn the video on. All right.
Hello. Okay.
Can you hear me okay? See me okay?
Actually, great. Yes. So,
All right, cool. This is really, really cool. Thank you so much to Dustin and the whole gang over there. I'm really impressed by the little thing you got going on there. It's really, really cool. And yeah, I'm honored that you wanted to have my live stream be a part of it. And I'm happy to be here to speak. Again, I'm just flattered for the invitation and happy to be here. And it was very interesting to listen to the earlier talks. I'm not sure how much my talk is going to connect up with the previous talks, but I did make a few notes in the margins here and there about some possible connections that I might take some time to pause on. But yeah, so what I want to talk about for my little slot is I want to talk about Patchwork as an empirical model a little bit, but also a little bit as a normative model, because there's this idea that capitalism is increasingly collapsing the fact-value distinction, and I think I tend to think that that's true, and I think what that means is that that which is empirically true increasingly looks to be normatively true also. Or if you're searching for a true model, you should be searching for models that are at once empirically well calibrated with reality, and also one should be looking for normative or ethical consistency. And you can kind of find the true model of in any particular situation by kind of triangulating along the empirical and the normative. So that's kind of how I think about Patchwork. I've been thinking about it in both of these dimensions, and that has allowed me to converge on a certain vision of what I think Patchwork involves or entails. And I've been writing a lot about that over the past couple months or so. And so what I'm going to do in this talk specifically, though, is not just rehash some ideas that I've been thinking about and writing about and speaking about the past couple months, but I'm going to try to break a little bit of ground, at least in my own, weird head, at the very least, in how some of these different ideas of mine connect or can be integrated. And so, in particular, I wrote a series of blog posts a few months ago on a certain concept of what I call reality forking. And forking is a term that comes from the world of software engineering. And so that's going to be one component of the talk. You'll see it's very obvious how that connects to the idea of Patchwork. And I'm also going to talk about this kind of vision for a communist patch that a lot of us have been interested in. I've been talking with a lot of people about this idea of the communist patch and soliciting, different people's impressions on it. And I also have written a few blog posts recently kind of sketching, kind of hand waving, if you will, at what a possibly communist patch might look like. And because, a lot of people think to this day, Patchwork has a very kind of right-wing connotation, I think, to this day, because primarily people think of Moldbug and Nick Land when they think of Patchwork. But I think it's not at all obvious that Patchwork necessarily has a right-wing flavor to it. I think we can easily imagine left-wing patches that would be as competitive and as successful as, more authoritarian patches. And so that's kind of what I've really been thinking a lot about recently. And even Nick Land himself told me that, there's nothing wrong with trying to think about and even build a communist patch. That's all fair play. He's much less bullish than I am on it, but be that as it may. So those two ideas I'm going to discuss basically in turn, and then try to connect them in a few novel ways. I have a few kind of points or comments or extrapolations or connections between these two different ideas I've been working on that I've never really written down before or quite articulated yet. So that's what I'm going to try to do here. So first of all, I was going to start this by talking a little bit about how Patchwork, I think, is already happening in a lot of ways, but I literally deleted many of the bullet points because Dustin's presentation basically covered that even better than I possibly could. So I'm not going to waste too much time talking about that. There's a lot of empirical, data right now that looks a lot like, fragmentation is the order of the day in an empirical sense. There's a lot of exit dynamics and fragmentation dynamics that we're observing in many domains. And yeah, Dustin articulated a lot of them. One thing I would say to kind of situate the talk, though, is it's worth noting that not everyone agrees with this. There's still a lot of kind of integrative talk nowadays. There's a lot of discourse about the necessity of building larger and larger organizations. You see this especially, I think, when people are talking about kind of global issues and major existential threats. So, for instance, often in the educated discourse around preventing nuclear threats, for instance, or AI, things like runaway kind of inhumane genetic testings, things like that. And you could probably think of a few others. Climate change would be the obvious big one, right? In a lot of these major global issues, the discourse around them, the expert opinions tend to have a kind of integrative, centralized tendency to them. I was actually just this morning, I happened to be listening to, I listened to a shitload of podcasts, and I was listening to a podcast with that Sam Harris did with Yuval Harari, this guy who wrote the book Sapiens, right? This mega global blockbuster of a book. And, seemed like a nice guy, seemed like a smart guy, of course, but everything he was saying was totally integrative. He was talking about, how we need things like international organizations and more global international cooperation to solve all of these different problems. And, and Sam Harris is just kind of nodding along happily. And that got me thinking, actually, because even if you read people like Nick Bostrom and people who are kind of more hard-nosed and analytical and interested in, things like intelligence explosion, you find in a lot of educated opinion the opposite of kind of a patchwork orientation. You find we need to cooperate at a global level. Anyway, the reason I mention this is just to, put it in context that the ideas we're interested, the ideas that we're all interested in and the empirical dynamics that we're pinpointing are not at all obvious to everyone, even though, I think when you really look at all of the fragmentation dynamics, I think it's increasingly hard to believe any idea, any proposal having to do with like getting all of the nation states to cooperate on something. I just don't see it. For instance, genetic engineering, like China is off to the races. I just don't see any way in which somehow the US and China are going to negotiate some sort of like pause to that. Anyway, so that's worth reflecting on. But one of the reasons that I mention that is because I kind of have a meta theory of precisely those discourses. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit later in my talk when I talk about the ethical implications, because I think a lot of that is basically lying. Okay. Like I think one of my theses is that when people are talking about how we have to organize some larger structure to prevent some moral problem, 9 times out of 10, that what they're actually doing is a kind of capitalist selling process. So like that's actually just a kind of cultural capitalism in which they're using, they're pushing moral buttons to get a bunch of people to basically pay them. I think that's basically, that is like a very modern persona. That's a modern mold. And that's precisely the type, that's one of many things that I think is being melted down in, the acceleration of capitalism. And what's really happening is all that's really like feasible in so many domains, all you can see for miles when you look in every possible direction is fragmentation, alienation, atomization, exits of all different kinds on all different kinds of levels. And then you have people who are like, we need to stop this. So give me your money and give me your votes. Like that. I think it's basically an unethical posture. I think it's a dishonest, disingenuous posture. And it's ultimately about, like accruing power to the people who are promoting that, usually like high status cultural elites in, the cathedral or whatever you want to call it. So that's why I think there are real ethical implications. I think if you want to not be like a liar and not be a kind of cultural snake oil salesman, which I think a lot of these people are, patchwork is actually, it's not only what's happening, but it's actually ethically, we're ethically obligated to hitch our wagons to patchwork dynamics, if only not to be a liar and a manipulator about the nature of the real issues that we are going to have to try to navigate somehow. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to kind of open up the talk with that reflection on kind of the current debate around these issues. So, okay, so the one dimension of patchwork dynamics or exit dynamics that we're observing, I think, empirically right now, that we're already in the midst of, that Dustin didn't talk about so much, or if he did, maybe someone talked about it, maybe I missed it, but didn't talk about as much as I would like to, is a kind of patchwork dynamics that's taking place on the social psychological level. So I've thought a lot about this, and I've written some on it, and to really drive this point home, I've had to kind of borrow a term from the world of software engineering. So I'll make this really quick and simple. Basically, when you're developing software and you have a bunch of people contributing to this like larger code base, you need some sort of system or infrastructure for how a bunch of people can edit the code at the same time, right? You need to keep that orderly, right? So there's this simple term, it's called forking. And so you have this code base, and if you want to make a change to the code base, you fork it, right? And so in a standard case, you might do what we call like a soft fork. So it's like I'm butchering the technical language a little bit. If there are any like hardcore programmers in the room, I'm aware that I'm being a little bit I'm painting with a broad stroke, but I'll get the point across, I think, effectively enough without being too nerdy about it. A soft fork means that you pull the code base off for your own purposes, but it ultimately can merge back in. Basically, is the simple idea there. But a hard fork is when you pull the code base off to edit it, and there's no turning back. There's no reintegrating your edits to the shared master branch or whatever you want to call it. So I use this kind of technical distinction between a soft fork and a hard fork to think about what's actually going on with social psychological reality and its distribution across Western societies today. And the reason that I do this is because I think you need this kind of language to really drive home how radical the social psychological problems are. I really think that we underestimate how much reality itself is being fragmented in different subpopulations. I think we are talking about we are now fundamentally entering into different worlds, and it's not at all clear to me that there's any road back to having some sort of shared world. And so I sketched this out in greater detail in the essay, and what I talk about is basically, in my view, the kind of traditional human society. You can think of it as a kind of system of constant soft forking, right? So individuals go off on, during the day or whatever, they go hunting, do whatever, traditional societies do. And at the end of the night, they integrate all of their experiences in a shared code base. So soft forks, but then it's merged back to the master branch around the campfire or whatever you want to call it, however you want to think about that. But it's only now that for the first time ever, we have the technological conditions in which individuals can fork the shared social code base, edit that code, and then never really integrate it back into the shared code base. And so this is what I call kind of the hard forking of reality. I think that is what we're living through right now. And I think that's why you see things like political polarization to a degree we've never seen before. That's why you see profound confusion and kind of miscommunication, just deep inabilities to even relate with each other across different groups, especially like the left-right divide, for instance. But you also see it with things like, think about someone like Alex Jones. Think about these like independent media platforms that are just on a vector towards outer space that it's hard to even relate it to anything like empirical that you can recognize. You see more and more of these kinds of hard reality forks, or that's what I call them. And yeah, so that's a kind of very serious, I think, kind of exit dynamic or patchwork dynamic that's happening. And I think educated opinion today underestimates how extreme that is and how much that's already taking place. It's not clear to me once this is underway, it's not clear to me how like someone who is, neck deep in the world of Alex Jones, and that is their sense of what reality is, how that person is ever going to be able to sync back up with, an educated person at Harvard University or something like that. It's not just those people can't have dinner together. That happened, several decades ago, probably, but they can't even. There's just no actual technical infrastructural pathway through which these two different worlds could be negotiated or made to converge into something shared. And I think that the radicalism of that break is a defining feature of our current technological moment. And that is a patchwork. That is an extraordinary patchwork dynamic. In other words, I think that patchwork is already here, but it's especially strong in the socio-psychological dimension, and that's very invisible. So people underestimate it. People often think of patchwork as a territorial phenomenon, and maybe one day it will be, but I think primarily for now it's socio-psychological, and that should not be underestimated, because you can go into fundamentally different worlds even in the same territory. That's kind of what the digital plane opens up to us. Okay, so that's one half of what I'm bringing to the table in this talk. There are a few, I think, antecedent conditions for what it's worth to kind of explain like why I think this is happening now. One is that there's been an extraordinary breakdown in the trust towards all kind of traditional institutionalized centralized systems. If you look at the public opinion data, for instance, on how people view Congress in the United States, or how people view Parliament or whatever, just trust in elected leaders. Like, you ask people, how much do you trust so-and-so? You look at the public opinion data since like the 50s, and it's really, really on the decline, on a consistent and pretty rapid decline. And this is true if you ask them about, what do you think about the mass media? What do you think about your politicians? What do you think about a whole bunch of mainstream traditional kind of institutions that were the, bedrock of modernized societies? People just don't take them seriously anymore at all. And I think that is because of technological acceleration. What's happened is that there is unprecedented complexity. There's just too much information. There's so much information that these modern institutions, they're really, really unwieldy. They're really unable to process the complexity that we now are trying to navigate. And people are seeing very patently that, Parliament, or, the United States Congress, or the traditional, public education system, whatever it might be, that all mass media for sure, that all of these systems are just patently and visibly not able to manage. They're not able to actually do or give what they're supposed to be giving, with this explosion of information that they were not designed to be able to handle. So it's kind of like a bandwidth problem, really. But because of that, there's people are dropping their attention away from these institutions, and they're looking outwards. They're looking elsewhere. They're looking for other forms of reality, because that's ultimately what's at stake here. I think that these traditional institutions, they supplied the shared reality. It was, even though people disagreed, they all referred back to these dominant institutions, because even if you don't like those institutions, in the 60s or whatever, in the 70s, even when people really didn't like those institutions, like the hippies or whatever, everyone kind of recognized them as existing, as powerful. So even opposing them, you kind of refer back to them. We're now post all of that, where people so mistrust them that they're not even referring back to them anymore, and they're taking their entire cues for what reality is from people like Alex Jones, or people like Jordan Peterson, or you name it. And you're going to see more and more fragmentation, more and more refinement of different types of realities for different subpopulations in an ever more refined way that aligns with their personalities and their preferences. And basically, they're kind of like consumer preferences. People are going to get the realities that they most desire in a highly fragmented market. Anyway, so I think I've talked enough about that. That's kind of my idea of reality forking. And that's my kind of model or observation about a deep form of patchwork that I think is already underway in a way that people underestimate. So, all right. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the ethics of patchwork, because I think the observations that I just presented, they raise ethical questions. And so if I am right that reality itself is already breaking up into multiple versions, multiple patches, well, then that raises some interesting questions for us, not just in terms of like what we want to do, but in terms of what should we do? I mean, what does it mean to seek the good life? And if this is in fact, the context, if this is in fact what's happening. And it seems to me that right now you're either going to be investing your efforts into somehow creatively co-constituting a new reality, or you're going to be just consuming someone else's reality. And a lot of us, I think, do a combination of this, like all the podcasts I listen to and all the YouTube videos I watch. That's me outsourcing reality creation to other people to some degree. But then the reason I've gotten on YouTube and the reason I've gotten really into all these platforms and investing myself, more in creating my own sense of the world is because I don't just want to be a consumer of other people's realities. I want to create a world that sounds awesome. That would be the ideal, right? But the problem is that people are differently equipped to either create or consume realities. And I think that this is a difficult and this is a very politically fraught problem. And, the left and the right will have debates about, the blank slate versus, the heritability of traits and all of that. And I don't want to get into that now, but however you want to interpret it, it is an obvious fact that some people are better equipped to do things like create systems than other people. Okay. And so that to me kind of just is the ethical political question space. Like, how do you do that ethically? And so I think the default mode right now is the one that I already described at the top of my talk, with people who it's the moralist, it's the kind of traditional left-wing moralist posture. Like, here's a program for how we're going to protect a bunch of people. All it requires is for you to sign up and to give me your votes and to like come to my meetings and give me your money. And somehow we're gonna get all together and we're gonna take state power and we're gonna like protect people or something like that. I think that's increased, as I already said. I won't beat a dead horse, but I think that's increasingly revealing itself to be like a completely impractical and not serious posture that plays with it suits our kind of moral taste buds a little bit, but it's increasingly and patently not able to keep up with accelerating capitalism. So that's not going to work. So what I would argue, this is why I think Patchwork is an ethical obligation, because if you're not going to manipulate people by trying to build some sort of like big, large centralized institution, kind of by manipulating their heartstrings, then what it remains for us to do is to create our own realities, basically. And I think that the most ethical way to do that is to do it honestly and transparently, to basically reveal this to reveal the source code of reality and theorize that and model that and make those blueprints and share those blueprints, and then get together with people that you want to get together with and literally make your own reality. So now I want to talk, I feel like that doesn't just sound cool and fun, but it's like you kind of have to do that, or else you're going to be participating in this like really harmful delusional charade. I think that's my view anyway. And so now I'll just kind of finish by telling you a little bit about what I think the ideal patch looks like ethically and practically. And yeah, so I've theorized this as what I've called it many different things. I haven't really settled on a convenient phrase to summarize this vision, but I've called for now I'll just call it, I think of it as a neo-feudal techno-communism. I think the ideal patch that will be both most competitive, most functional, most desirable and successful as a functioning political unit, but also that is ethically most reflective and consistent with the true nature of human being, is it's going to look something a little bit like European feudalism, and it's going to be basically communist, but with contemporary digital technology. So let me unpack that for you a little bit. You probably have a lot of questions. One thing is that Patchwork always sounds a little bit like intentional communities, and in the left, the intentional communities kind of have a bad rap because they've never really worked. By intentional communities, I just mean people who want to start a little group somewhere off in the woods or whatever, and like make the ideal society, and then somehow that's going to magically grow and take over or something like that. It usually doesn't end well. It doesn't have a good historical track record. It usually ends up in some kind of cult, or else it just fizzles out and is like unproductive or whatever. But I think that the conditions now are very different. And I think if you want to talk about building a patch, you have to kind of explain why your model is different than all of the other intentional communities that have failed. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. One is that obviously, the digital revolution, it has been a game changer, I think. And most of the examples of failed intentional communities come from a pre-digital context. I mean, that's one obvious point. So I think the search space, the solution space has not at all been exhausted. That's kind of just a simple point. But another thing that I've thought a lot about and have written some about is that a lot of the earlier, intentional communities, one of the reasons that they fail is because of self-selection. And that's just a fancy social science term for, there's a certain type of person who historically has chosen to do intentional communities, and they tend to have certain traits. And I think for many reasons, that has caused, I don't want to spend too much time getting into it, but it's not hard to imagine why that causes problems, right? So if all the people are really good at certain things, but really bad at other things, you have these really kind of you have very lopsided communities in terms of personality traits and tendencies. And I think that's one of the reasons why things have led to failure. So what's new now, I think, is that because the pressure towards patchwork is increasingly going to be forced through things like climate change and technological shocks of all different kinds, economic shocks of all different kinds, because these are fairly random kind of systemic exogenous shocks, what that means is it's going to be forcing a greater diversity of people into looking for patches or maybe even needing patches. And I think that is actually valuable for us who want to, make new worlds and make better worlds, because it actually is nature kind of imposing greater diversity on the types of people that we'll have to actually make different patches. So yeah. So what exactly does neo-feudal techno-communism look like? Basically, it would have a producer elite. And this is why, this is where a lot of like my left-wing friends start rolling their eyes, because it basically is kind of like an aristocracy. Like, look, there's going to be a small number of people who are exceptionally skilled at things like engineering and who can do things that most other people can't. You need at least a few people like that to engineer really sophisticated systems. And so those systems I have in mind, this is something that Casey said before. I think Casey's the name, if I recall correctly, that the mayor should be sysadmin. It's kind of a similar idea that I'm talking about. You'd have a small number of elite engineer types, and basically they can do all of the programming for the system that I'm about to describe in just a minute. But they also do is they make money in the larger techno-commercium. So like they would run a small business basically that would trade with other patches, and it would make money in probably very automated ways. So it would be a sleek, agile kind of little corporation of producer elites at the top of this feudal pyramid of a patch society. But then there would be a diversity of individuals, including many poor, unskilled, disabled people who don't have to do anything basically, or they can do little jobs around the patch or whatever to help out. And so the first thing you might be thinking, and this is the first objection I get from people is, why would these like highly productive, potentially rich, computer programmers want to support, this patch of poor and unskilled people who don't do anything? Isn't the whole problem today, Justin, that, the rich don't want to pay for these things and they will just exit and evade? Well, my kind of novel idea here is that there is one thing that the rich today cannot get their hands on, no matter where they look. And I submit that it's a highly desirable, highly valuable human resource that most people really, really, really want. And that is genuine respect and admiration and deep social belonging. So, most of the rich today, they know that people have a lot of resentment towards them. They don't like, presumably they don't like the psychological experience of like being on the run from national governments and putting their money in like Swiss bank accounts. Like they probably don't like feeling like criminals who everyone more or less kind of resents and wants to get the money of or whatever. So my hypothesis here is that if we could engineer a little social system in which they actually felt valued and desired and admired and actually received some respect for their, skills and talents that they do have and the work that they do put in, I would argue that if you could guarantee that they would get that respect and the poor would not try to take everything from them, if you could guarantee those things, then the communist patch would actually be preferable to the current status quo for the rich people in particular. My argument is that this would be preferable. It would be a voluntary, preferable choice for the rich because of this kind of unique new achievement that the poor and normal people won't hate them and will actually admire them for what they deserve to be admired for. So then the question becomes, well, how do you guarantee that that's going to happen? This is where technology comes in, because I think that what you can do is the poor and less able people can make commitments nowadays using new technology They can make commitments to a certain type of a certain set of, let's call them good behaviors or whatever. And then we can basically enforce that through trustless decentralized systems, namely, of course, blockchain. So what I'm imagining is, if you can imagine something like the Internet of Things, all of these kinds of home devices that we see more and more nowadays that have sensors built in and can passively and easily monitor all types of measures in the environment. You imagine connecting that up to blockchain and specifically smart contracts, so that basically the patch is being constantly measured, like your behavior and the patch is being constantly measured. You might have like skin conductance measures on your wrist. There might be audio speakers recording everyone's voice at all times. I know that sounds a little authoritarian, but stick with me. Basically, by deep monitoring of everything using Internet of Things, what we can do is basically we can, as a group, agree on what is a fair measure of, a satisfactory level of honesty, for instance. And so let's say the rich people say, like, I'll guarantee you a dignified life and give you X amount of money each month. You don't have to do anything for it, as long as you respect me. You don't tell lies about me. You don't plot to take all of my money or whatever. And you would have like, Alexa or whatever would be like constantly recording what everyone says. That would be hooked up to like a smart contract. And so like if you tell some lie about how like the producer aristocrat, he punched me the other day. He was a real ignoble asshole. And that's actually not true. Well, all of the speech that people are saying would be constantly compared to some database of truth. Like it could be like Wikipedia or whatever. And every single statement would have some sort of like probability of being true or false or something like that. That could all be automated, that through Internet of Things, feeding this information to the internet basically and checking it for truth or falsehood. And then you have some sort of model that says like, if a statement has a probability of being false that is higher than, maybe set it really high to be careful, right? Like higher than 95%. So only lies that can be really strongly confirmed through, internet fact checking in an automated way. Those are going to get, reported basically to the community as a whole. And if you have X amount of bad behaviors, then you lose your entitlement to your aristocrat producers, noblesse oblige, the old kind of, feudal term for basically aristocratic communism, the generosity of nobles. So that's all like a very kind of skittish little sketch of how Internet of Things and smart contracts could be used to kind of create this idea of a Rousseauian general will. Because what I would argue is that the reason why this has never worked in history is because of lying, basically. People can always defect. People can always manipulate and say they're going to do one thing, but then not deliver it. And that's on the side of the rich and also on the side of the poor. But it's at least in sight now, the possibility that we could basically define very rigorously what the ideal expectations of everyone in the community is, what those ideal expectations are, I should say, and program that in transparent smart contracts, hook those up to sensors that are doing all of the work for us in the background. And in this way, basically automate like radically guaranteed egalitarian communist system in which people do have different abilities, but everyone has an absolutely, dignified lifestyle guaranteed for them, as long as they're not like total assholes who break the rules of the group. And as I said, I think if you could actually engineer this in a way that rich people would find it preferable to how they're currently living. So to me, that's actually a viable way of building communism that hasn't really been tried before. And I think it really suits a kind of patchwork model. I think that this would be something like this would be the absolutely ideal patch. And not just in a productive, successful way. Like this is the ideal way to make a large group of people maximally productive and happy and feel connected and integrated. Like everyone has a place and everyone belongs, even if, there's a little bit of difference in aptitude. The system, the culture will reflect that, but in a dignified and fair and reasonable, kind way, so mutually supportive way. And yeah, I think that would be most productive. And I think it would also be, I think that's the most ethically desirable way to organize the society. And I think it's now becoming available to us. That's my pitch. I think I could say more, but I feel like I haven't been keeping time. I feel like I've been talking enough. I could go off on any of those points a little bit more, but I'm happy to kind of to wrap it up there. I would even point out more specifically. I found out recently that hat tip to my friend the JMO, who might be in the chat right now. Actually, the town of Toomsboro, Georgia, is right now for sale for only 1.7 million. I think that's a pretty good deal. It comes with like it's a whole town. It comes with like a railroad station. It comes with like a sugar factory, all kinds of stuff. And you could easily build a little prototype patch that I just described of diverse people, and go in on a mortgage for buying a whole town in Georgia. And that's like not 1.7 million. If you have a bunch of people and it's a major publicized project, it wouldn't be that hard to raise enough for a mortgage on a 1.7 million property, especially if you have like a compelling white paper along the lines that I just sketched. I'm not quite there yet, but that's what I'm thinking about, and that's my model or my vision of the communist patch. So I'm going to cut myself off there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interesting talk. So, Sebastian, are you ready to Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone have any questions or from here? Or I think we'll save the questions for later as well. Because I think also you have some questions probably from your feed. So
Yeah.
So we could try to tie in all these questions at the end too. So cool. All right. So Sebastian.
Hi there. I would really need my presentation up, please. Yeah.
I can't hear that well. I'm sorry.
And now, is it better?
Yes.
Nice, thanks. Yeah. Is it up? Okay, yeah. Okay, so my name is Sebastian.